Well, welcome again to another session of the 15th annual Transforming the Teaching and Learning Environment virtual conference. Yes, I'm still Bob Hales. I'm still your moderator. Uh, Again, I need to get a plug for the Wall Street Journal, who's our sponsor this year. Uh, During the, well, at least noon break, if you're in the central time zone. Each day this week, they have something going on. I'd appreciate it if you'd take a few minutes and stop by and see what they have. They have a lot of resources for higher education. This session is for tried and true methods for engaging students in class. Have with us Jennifer Baker, professor of philosophy at the College of Charleston. She writes on virtue ethics. That sounds interesting.
Oh, good.
Updating ancient ideas for today, and teaches courses ranging from bioethics to whatever PPE is and stoicism. It's interesting. So
Good.
let's turn it over to you, Jennifer, and take it away.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I am never hurt by thinking about teaching. And it certainly keeps you on your toes to try and combine teaching of the most ancient things we have and using some very ancient methodology with all the technology we have available to us. I've been appreciating the technology available to us. I have a few tricks that have worked for me in getting students to talk a lot in class. And I've been able to enhance some of this trickery with technological resources I have, VoiceThread I'll mention. But I'm going to begin with a lot of apologies. So, you know, I know philosophers are strange because they're always the worst people to have in teacher training on campus because they literally say things like my friend Simon Blackburn said here. Why should we change what works? I also want to apologize for pretending even for a moment that I have teaching figured out. I mean, it's the most humbling of disciplines, I think, because my success in the classroom really depends on who's there. And I'm always thinking I'm maybe one semester away from not being able to relate to students. I've had to change through the years and modify my style. I also am very well aware that professors who teach so differently than I do with different objectives, I mean, a different underlying basis or framework, I'll mention my framework in a moment, have incredible results and students are incredibly grateful for approaches I would assume students don't like and don't learn from. So I could not be more humble about this. And I always need help because I do agree teaching is a skill which requires grasp of principles that I can't quite articulate, and I've never really found anyone else able to articulate. So I feel like I'm constantly attempting to fit practices that work with larger principles. So, you know, I always need help articulating those principles or even, you know, reflecting on what we're doing. So I really appreciate any feedback and even the chance to articulate this. Now, I do think it's fair to announce, you know, what framework you're using. And I'm a little nervous about some approaches I see in published writing on teaching where a study on like memory or cognition will be connected to some recommended change in the classroom. So that just seems hasty to me. And I feel like we probably each have some sort of framework on human understanding and learning and motivation. And we might as well say what they are because we might disagree with each other and these things aren't easy to settle. So I, of course, would be embarrassed if anything I said was at odds with research on memory and learning. But I'm really using an approach in behavioral science. George Ainsley is my favorite articulator of this approach, although it's like a widely shared framework. And the basic commitments are what I really, I mean, I'm not afraid of the detail either, but the basic commitments are that we don't get to decide to just pay attention in class. There are a lot of factors we aren't in direct control of when it comes to how much attention we're paying in class or how much we're capable of remembering. So I think of us that way. I think of us as needing to feel a reward for our attention. So I don't take for granted that education is rewarding, or that a lecture is rewarding or pleasurable, or even that speaking your mind in class is pleasurable or rewarding. I think of that as all something we have to be very active about creating. So the person themselves is going to have to do several things to find education rewarding, or the experience in the classroom or the class itself rewarding. And I need to be mindful that I need to set things up so that they can do that. I have goals that are kind of boring to read, but maybe some of these are uniquely challenging for some subjects over others. I'm not sure about that, but we do have this issue in philosophy, at least, where the readings are not designed for undergraduates. I don't want to use readings that are designed for undergraduates. I want them to, have read Aristotle, even if they only understand it a bit, because I do have some confidence that they might find it rewarding in my class to engage with Aristotle, and they may have the resources to understand him in 10 years. So I don't want to hide from them the real philosophy. I want students to not just memorize, it's a philosophy class, but I really want them to be confident enough to be analytical about the readings, to break the readings down, to criticize the authors. That's just Socrates right there. No respect for authority unless you can see why the reasons, unless you can see the reasons their arguments deserve respect. And then I really want students to think that their own perspective and what's clear to them is relevant to the rest of us. That's something philosophy kind of makes easy to do. And I do think it's engaging. I often say it's easier to teach philosophy than other things for that reason. And then I also want to be very aware of how many different moments might lend themselves to learning. And I can't really predict when the learning happens. So I try and offer a buffet of options, a lot of approaches to something a student might take in and retain. Just a joke about how difficult Aristotle is to read from Jonathan Barnes. Reading him is like eating dried hay. I think that's fair. So when we make it exciting to read Aristotle, I do think we are doing a lot of setup. And then to put the challenges more general, to make them more general, so that other fields might relate to them too, with philosophy or with ethics. Students don't have a prior class almost all of the time. That's the case. The texts are difficult, as I mentioned. The students have to bring their own thought to these texts. So it's not just that they're memorizing or, memorizing lists or, regurgitating what they've been taught. We need them to consider whether the views are right or wrong. We don't present a view as right or wrong. So they have to develop arguments and make decisions between the views and tear down or analyze the view. So I think that's additional to just learning something or trusting a source. And then I've also had this problem of, I don't want to make it too easy for students because then they won't do 3. So if I can break everything down and they can just memorize a few points, or what do they ask for sometimes? A study guide. I really resist study guides because that would be to skip everything I think is important about being in a philosophy class. The last thing I want them to do is to study a study guide. There are some descriptions of what we want from philosophy students, but they're a little, poetical. So I'm not sure this is really easy to implement, but I agree. We want them to parse and separate claims when they exist in prose. We want them to detect inconsistencies, equivocations. We want them to recognize logical errors. We want them to replace accounts with something simpler whenever possible. We're cautious about accepting evidence. So we don't rest easy just because there's some data on something. We're suspicious all the time. And of course, we don't want to make it fun to just take sides or, you know, consider some view is in style, another view is out of style. We try and resist those sorts of trends, and those things are fun. So we give up on a little fun there. I'm almost done with the preliminaries, but I do love this example from Bernard Williams. And he says what philosophy seeks from students is similar to what, oh, looking at the comment, looks good, similar to what happens when manufacturers of cake mixes create things so that you have to add an egg. I had never thought about this before, but of course, you could just add water. They could make it so that you just add water. But people like to contribute something, I guess they've discovered in their way. And I think that is a good analogy to why you want students to really contribute their own thought and takes in a philosophy class. It's not that you couldn't present the full mix to them and make it simpler, but there's something about their experience of adding an egg that will make them enjoy the process more. Maybe it feels more authentic. You know, students change their mind, so it's not as if what they're contributing or what their take is will stay their take. I love when there's change in views, when students track change in their views, but there is something important, I think, about students, you know, literally engaging with the material as they understand it at that moment. And then there's a little dry, but of course, some of the skills philosophy requires are the same skills that other academic fields require. So the one difference, I think, is that in philosophy, I mean, maybe this is also true in science at a certain level, but maybe not physics at a lower level, but at a certain level, you do want students to realize what has not been settled in a philosophy class. And I think that is a challenge of its sort. You know, there are jokes about there being no right or wrong answer in philosophy. And I can see our tolerance for students' views being interpreted in that way, but it actually makes it, I think, challenging then to argue for something being right or wrong in that type of tolerant situation where we'll kind of take any argument that's presented to us, challenging to grade, challenging to get students to accept our grading, but I think it goes over well. You know, I think philosophers live up to this challenge. And then my last little proviso, I'll finally get to my tips. I am always careful to not forget, there have been warnings about the sort of narcissism of teaching since, you know, long ago. And Eric Schlieser has written on this. We do get flattered by students enjoying our class. And I do need to remember that I don't want them to just enjoy the class and just appreciate me for that. So focusing on the goals I really have for students long-term is something I try to remind myself of. And I don't think I get very flattered by students just saying they like the class. In fact, they like it a lot at the beginning, and then when it gets difficult, I know some of them will change their view a bit. Here's what I do, though, to keep my classes really lively, and they do show up even without attendance policy. I dropped that during COVID, and I'm not sure I had it barely ever in the past. So I'm always very complimented by that, not in the way Seneca warns about, but I think it's a good sign that they make it even to my early morning courses in great number. So I like to prepare students for the reading. I make them write after they've read before class. And then I do get them all talking, every single person. I typically have a class of about 40. I mean, I have to repeat it, but we have smaller rooms at my college. So we tend to just teach 40. I've taught, sometimes I get lucky and I get to teach 80 or 100 at once, but usually it's 40. And then I review for them. Why I prepare students for the readings. I do this for a couple reasons. I've experimented with it. The only downside I can see is that they aren't going to have that joy of encountering something on their own for the first time. But I tend to think this really is a great moment with literature and not philosophy so much. I have friends who try and read Kierkegaard on their own, and it sounds like I'm fibbing, but I think it's been about 10 years and he's on, page 7 or something. And I try and tell him, you can't read philosophy on your own. It's so difficult. So I think of philosophy as kind of, something we need help with, something I was taught, by my professors, but taught in a way so that I have turned to the text after I get explanations. So I don't want to leave them nothing to do after I give a preview of the reading, but I definitely don't want them to skip the reading because it's going to be explained in class. So with the trade-off between those, I found previewing really good. The students won't even recognize the argument in the reading if you don't kind of incentivize that. So I will make sure to tell them that it happens and, kind of where it happens. I don't have this like represented as a separate point, except for maybe that last one, but I've seen some research on how discouraging it is to not understand a couple vocabulary words in a row. And I asked about that just the other day with students and they all nodded. So there are incredibly, unusual terms in philosophy. I don't think anyone does it on purpose, but we do like to formalize concepts and refer to one thing if we can instead of something general. And students aren't going to have run into these terms. So I preview those and then they can get into the middle of the paper where the argument resides. Another problem with philosophy papers is that alternative views are represented all the time before they're knocked down. So you don't want a student skimming, like you actually really want them to find the structure of the thing and not mistake a representation of a view that gets rejected by the author for the author's view, which happens constantly if I don't preview. And then finally, the students are supposed to be critical of these readings. And if I get to set it up that way, I think they tend to see themselves that way as the audience. Just a reminder that I am dependent on a lot of research on teaching. I would not have guessed how few students do the reading typically. This set of studies, so published 2018, was talking about how few students read before class, different metrics and different ways of assessing that. And it was a depressing like 25%. So I just would not have guessed that on my own. And they do a good job in this article, and the previous one is really helpful to me too, explaining how professors get misled. So people might have the skill of saying something clever in a class discussion, and that is not indicative of whether they've done the reading. And one thing I've really learned to pay attention to, because of, I think it's this research in particular, a lot of students don't purchase the book. And it would never have occurred to me to ask about that. Now I do, and I do find a lot of them have not purchased the book. The books are very, in philosophy, they're not that $50 or something, but that's still very expensive to most college students. And I think there are various ways they think they can get around getting the book. So now I'm very, very conscious of these things. And I do my best to make sure they get the book. And one way I make sure they've done the reading after I preview it is I have them write. This is not fancy. I do have a lot of students. Some semesters I have 120. That's like too much for me, but I make this as easy as possible for myself and still, I think, get a lot of benefit for students from this. I just create a blog. So this is me being a bit of a Luddite because I should be using, I guess, my campus online system, but it's so ugly. I think they feel when they're in there, they're kind of down to business. I want our class blog to be a little more fun. I get to, make it a little prettier than I would otherwise. And I also get to link to things I mention in lecture. It's kind of fun for me, honestly. And I just don't feel that way about using Oaks or Canvas. So I know I generate more from them in this way. And then they just comment as commentators, in any news story. And they do seem to have some practice with that. They never seem very worried about how much they need to write. Let me show you. So this is about how much they tend to write. I mean, they ask for a lot of information about what a paper is these days. The final paper seems to be something some of my students have never heard of. But with these comments, I just seem to have no trouble when I say write one. They seem to write about this much. And my rationale is multifold, but they do get rewarded for doing the reading if they're gonna comment. I've been told by students that they have to triage, and if the professor doesn't set up an incentive to read, and this is very depressing, but the incentive can't be a quiz that punishes most students. I have colleagues who've been very cute about admitting their quizzes aren't effective anymore. So they'll have a really difficult reading question. But if most students are failing it stops being motivated. And I also imagine that makes you not enjoy reading. I want this to be enjoyable. I want them to feel rewarded when they do the reading. So letting them comment on what they want and not criticizing it. I'll correct things in class, but I don't correct students individually. I think that helps them to feel it's kind of their spot on the blog. I stay out of the comment section, and they seem to really perform for each other, which totally makes sense to me. I now have a child in college, and I mean, I'm learning a lot from his experience, but they care so much about those other students. And I don't think from my perspective at the front of the room, I realize that. So they really show off for each other. They don't want to seem dumb. I'm sure that could change. I'm sure I could have a class where it's cool to be smart aleck or something in the comments, but I haven't seen that yet. So it seems like a lot of positive modeling. The really bright students who write first set a kind of standard, and you see other students attempt to sound like that student and add something. So it's just beautiful. I like to not criticize their views directly. Well, it helps me to write lectures because I'll see mistakes that are made. But I want them to realize most of their comments will be something they might disagree with in the near future. They will write comments they won't like. Sometimes I'll collect them at the end of the semester and kind of send them back to them in one document. I've given final exam questions where they kind of correct their previous comments, but I don't do that so much anymore because it is cringy to use their language because they really do change their mind. And so it's this wonderful experience. If you've written a comment complaining about something that I then persuade you is good or not worth complaining about in class, you get to feel your mind has changed in class. And I'm not describing that as well as I normally do, because students usually know what I'm talking about. You're not singled out, you're not embarrassed. It's, you're the only one realizing this, but it is very interesting to be convinced of something. And when they commit to a view, I tell them to be bold. I mean, the comments are boring if they don't kind of stake out a position. I guess they like kind of create interesting comments without much goading. But if they're willing to stake out a position because they're not going to get graded on anything but doing the comment, I feel that they're more, there's more authenticity in it. They're more honest. And then to change their mind or realize they're wrong because of something I say in class is a real moment. I like them liking that. And then, of course, writing is a really good way for us to process what we've learned. I mean, I think of it as, requiring memory, retrieving what was in the text. I'm really dependent on it. I mean, I just don't think my students would learn but a fraction of a small fraction of what they do if I did not require this kind of constant writing on any new reading. And then this is pretty simple and it might be really common, but it's always worked for me since I was a graduate student. I make them turn to their neighbors and discuss things many times throughout the class. I try and pay attention to how long people can pay attention to a lecturer. And so about every 5 minutes or so, I ask them to either, discuss what I just said, which is, it's great to see them try to remember what I just said. They look as if they're paying attention, but you see them like, wait, what did she just say? They, literally, it's not that easy to process something that was just said to you. I ask kind of fun questions. They get a chance to kind of vent. I mean, I stay out of their business. I give them about 30 seconds. It's ridiculously short, but the time I give them is really utilized by them because they burst into conversation. So because they know I do this, they wait to talk or to complain about something I've said or something the authors said. I imagine it's mostly complaints or worries, but I like that. I mean, that's great for philosophy. It's wonderful for shy students. I try to be my children are shy. I try and be really sensitive to students who are shy, and I do not want to call on them. I don't want to make them present. So we always do the thing where one person in the group can share the ideas with the class. It just seems to work beautifully. Nobody stays silent. So, you're going to want to pay attention, and nobody's on their phone because they are going to be interacting socially in just a few minutes about the course topic. And because I keep it so ridiculously short, I always tease, I really want them to discuss these things later. But to spark that conversation in class, and they just don't talk about weekends or anything like that. They don't have time. I don't make it that fun. This was just a report from a teaching observation. I like it. I mean, I'm not sure why people wait around for questions or comments from a few students in class. I just feel like the energy of my class comes from this practice, and it's extremely high energy. I'm sure they get more confident, asking me questions about my lecture in lecture because they've already been talking they're loosened up. They talk a lot in class, even though it's in this kind of structured way. And then, of course, there's some really good research on how difficult it is to gauge what's going on in a classroom. So my last tip where I finally use some technology is I do email them after class, and they seem to be very grateful for this. And what I've been doing is using VoiceThread. And I feel like my colleagues could get very angry with me about this practice, but they view them, they appreciate them. I often can reuse my slides from class. Sometimes I create new slideshows, but I get to treat this as an after class. I don't present everything. I mean, my goodness, that would keep them from coming to class. I go over things I might not have finished explaining, or things I have second thoughts about explaining, or I can even add a little detail that I wouldn't have thought to get to except for comments that come from class. So it's really an after class little mini review. And they don't mind VoiceThread. They, link right to it and click through the slides at their own pace. I think I got encouraged to do this when we had to switch to VoiceThread when the pandemic began. And I had different students than the ones who were giving me a lot of feedback about lecture, saying they appreciated the VoiceThreads because they really got a chance. I often put the text on there. I forgot to mention that, but they really appreciated the chance to go at their own pace. I go pretty quickly. And on the VoiceThread slides, I can put a very complicated paragraph and walk students through it, or at least give them the chance to get my overview and then look at it carefully. I just feel like that's a different mode than the pages they're reading. And it just seems like the eyeballs really do go to these voice threads. So, you know, I can see how many of them view them. I think I can even see how long they spend. And I would say if you just kind of cruise through these voice threads, it's about a 20-minute experience. And they've gotten the habit of expecting them. And I don't mind the time. It kind of helps clear my head too, and gets me, you know, really confident about what we covered in class and where we are. And then I also send them reminders about what's on the syllabus. Yes, is this using technology? I guess so. I mean, I use OAKS for this, and a lot of my colleagues don't like that, but I've gotten a lot of thanks from students that I do this. I am kind of sympathetic with how busy they are. Some of my best students work full time as well. So I send out reminders consistently after class about what's due on the next class, even though, of course, I don't deviate from the syllabus. You know, they do not like that. So I try to avoid that at all costs, but they just like getting that little reminder. And then I notice that if I email them after every class, it encourages them to get back to me if they have some sort of issue. And I don't mind that. You know, I know some professors really do mind that, but I like encouraging them to get in touch. So it helps the course to seem organized. I think it helps put it on the priority list since they're doing triage when it comes to their assignment. I do think the more anxious students know that this review is coming, so they are a little less panicky, which helps me as a philosopher in class. I like when they listen and think in class. If they know the slides are coming or a review is coming, that's where they can focus while they're, you know, loosely discussing something in class. You know, it's a good reminder of what we went over. And then, like I mentioned, those who have trouble with the reading at least are going to read the slides. And there is some research that has encouraged me to send out these reminders. I don't think they weaken students or anything like that. And I like multiple exposures. You know, it helps me if they keep up. It helps me if they're mindful of what's going on in the class. You know, ongoing challenges. Do I think they can do the reading on their own? And do I think they begin at the beginning, end at the end, and read every passage? Not at my school. I've been at schools where they read the footnotes, but at my school, I don't think they do all the reading. Sometimes I worry some of them do, and I'm a little skeptical. I've laughed already about how strange final papers seem to my students now. I really have to defend them. I'm a big fan of them, but I really get asked, like, why would you require something like that? And then I'm always, you know, attempting to please every student. And I do think that's very difficult because, you know, they have different requirements for that. And I want to encourage students, but encouraging all the students can sometimes be annoying to the top students. You know, focusing on the top students can, of course, be alienating to the students who are having trouble. I mean, I'm just impressed any of us make it through a semester, honestly. I wish people who weren't professors tried to get the kind of approval we get in a typical day of teaching. I mean, I think there's a lot of arrogance out there from people who don't realize that this, you know, even an audience of 40, these are 40 people with completely different preferences at any moment. And we have to coordinate all their expectations and leave them pleased. And I'm always worried about how we scale up the type of concern we have for individual students. And again, I'm very grateful to everybody who pulls it off. Thanks, guys. Anyone have any objections? Anne Huth seems to be a very self-motivated person. That's wonderful. maybe I'll put up my last slide. Okay, well, I really appreciate it. I hope that wasn't too tedious. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. This is a very friendly conference. I'll see you at later talks.
Yeah. I like the early on talked about entertaining, and yeah, you can be entertaining and nobody learns anything,
Right.
and
Not that easy.
yeah, and rather than on evaluations, students say, oh, I really enjoyed the class. It'd be better to have them say, I really learned a lot in the class.
Yeah, right. There's something, I know I'm guilty of this, but lectures can be really pleasant to experience when you aren't paying attention even. Does that make sense? I like a lecture. That's like a relaxing experience. You don't want to expect to be called on or anything. That's going to make you nervous, but I'm really comfortable just listening. I'm not sure I retain much in that mode. So yeah, they're going to compliment us just for lecturing, and who knows what they're getting out of it. Of course, I do have great sympathy for teachers, so I'm glad they're grateful that we even lecture. So I don't mean to complain about their gratitude. More, please. Okay, thanks. Is that it? Should we give them a break between?
I like the approaches it from a philosophical perspective too, and I don't think people do that very much when they teach. And
Yeah, or we don't get the time to try out our idea. I'm sure we are, but how often do we get asked about our teaching philosophy? Not that often.
yeah,
Who wants to hear that? Not the students. In fact, we might want to hide it from them for reasons. Okay, well, thanks again. I guess I will. Thank you.
yeah,
I appreciate it. Sorry, I zoomed through those pretty quickly, but it always helps me. So please, anyone get in touch if they like want the slideshow or anything like that. I think I do have the research I mentioned in PDF form, and can't thank you enough, Bob.
okay, Wei, I thank you. This was not only entertaining,
Oh, good.
I learned a lot too.
Good. Yeah, the hard part, the easy part and the hard part. Thanks, Bob. Nice meeting you.